Most people assumed Japanese troops were dying in the Pacific because American snipers were better shots, until the day commanders realized their men weren't being outgunned at all. They were being lured. Out in the jungle, Marines discovered that the deadliest weapon wasn't a rifle or a scope or even a sniper hidden in the trees, but something far more humiliating: the enemy's inability to ignore what might matter. Every flash, every sound, every anomaly. Each one forced a decision. And somewhere along the perimeter, an American realized a terrifying truth. If you could control what the enemy had to investigate, you didn't need to hunt them. They would step into your sights on their own. What followed wasn't a single clever trick. It was a collapse. Patrols slowed. Observers froze. Officers hesitated, caught between investigating and dying, or ignoring and operating blind. And in that moment, Japanese forces understood why their positions kept falling silent. Not because the Americans had better weapons, but because they had learned how to weaponize attention itself. The jungle did not announce danger. It absorbed it. On Bougainville, danger arrived without sound, without warning, without spectacle. It arrived as absence. A Marine who didn't answer. A patrol that came back short, one man. A firing position that went silent after a single shot, then never revealed itself again. The men learned quickly what this meant. There was a sniper out there. Not the kind that fired wildly or took easy shots. This one waited. He watched. He chose moments when movement was unavoidable, a head lifting for binoculars, a hand adjusting a radio wire, a silhouette stepping into a narrow clearing for just a second too long. And every time, the same result followed. One shot. One body. Then nothing. No muzzle flash. No echo to triangulate. No trail to follow. American units tried everything they knew. They sent patrols to sweep suspected tree lines. The patrols slowed, spread out, grew cautious, and were punished for it. They called for artillery strikes, only to discover that jungle canopy swallowed explosions and left firing positions untouched. They brought in more rifles, more scopes, more men, and still the sniper remained untouched. The problem wasn't a lack of firepower. It was that the enemy never gave them anything to shoot back at. Japanese snipers in the Pacific were not lone wolves chasing kill counts. They were observers first, intelligence collectors, living sensors embedded deep into the terrain. Their job was not to dominate the battlefield, it was to shape it. They tracked movement patterns. They marked supply routes. They watched how long it took medics to respond. They noted which positions relaxed at dawn and which stiffened at dusk. Every report they sent back tightened the net. American commanders understood this in theory. In practice, there was nothing they could do about it. A sniper you could see was a sniper you could kill. A sniper you couldn't see was a problem that bled you slowly, day after day, until morale cracked. And morale was cracking. Men stopped trusting quiet. They flinched at stillness. Every shadow became suspicious. Every pause felt loaded. The jungle, once just terrain, became an accomplice. Then came the losses that changed the tone entirely. Not a dramatic firefight. Not a failed assault. Just a moment. A Marine lifting binoculars for a few seconds longer than he should have. A single crack of sound. And another body carried back through the brush heavier than it should have been. Because grief adds weight. That was when anger crept in. Anger tempts bad decisions. It pushes men to rush, to expose themselves, to chase revenge instead of solutions. But on Bougainville, anger ran headfirst into a wall of discipline. Every reckless impulse was punished immediately. It became clear that reacting faster would not save them. Shooting harder would not solve it. Hunting the sniper directly was exactly what the sniper wanted. The Americans were playing the enemy's game and losing. What made the situation worse was the realization that the sniper wasn't just killing men. He was controlling behavior. Units adjusted schedules. Patrols shortened routes. Observers hesitated before reporting anything that might require them to expose themselves again. The battlefield was shrinking, not because of enemy movement, but because of fear of observation. And that was the turning point. Because someone, somewhere along that perimeter, stopped asking the usual question, "Where is the sniper?" and asked a far more dangerous one. Why does he keep winning without being seen? The answer wasn't marksmanship. It wasn't camouflage. It wasn't superior optics. It was obligation. The enemy had to watch. They had to investigate. They had to respond to anything that looked like it might matter. That wasn't a flaw in the enemy's character. It was a flaw in doctrine. Japanese forces were trained to treat uncertainty as a threat. Any unexplained movement, any unfamiliar signal, any anomaly on the battlefield demanded attention. Ignoring it could mean allowing an attack to unfold unseen. Investigating it was dangerous, but failing to do so was unacceptable. Discipline demanded curiosity, and that meant curiosity could be exploited. At first, the idea sounded absurd. No new weapon, no new equipment, no change in manpower, just a shift in how the battlefield presented information to the enemy. The realization was subtle, almost uncomfortable. If the enemy could not ignore anomalies, then anomalies could be created, not to confuse but to compel, not to distract but to force movement. Because the sniper didn't need to be found, he just needed to be made to look. And once he looked, once he shifted, once he adjusted position even slightly, the advantage flipped. The jungle, which had hidden him so effectively, would betray him just long enough. What followed was not an explosion of violence, but a quiet reordering of power. The Americans stopped chasing the sniper. Instead, they began shaping what the sniper saw. And in the jungle, where every decision was measured in seconds and inches, that was enough to turn certainty into hesitation and hesitation into death. To understand why the balance could be flipped, you have to understand how the enemy saw the battlefield. Japanese forces in the Pacific did not treat snipers as lone hunters. They treated them as eyes, as extensions of command, as forward instruments of control. A rifle was only one part of the job. Observation was the real weapon. A good observer didn't fire often. A great one barely fired at all. He watched trails and clearings. He noted when Marines moved carelessly and when they tightened up. He learned which positions relaxed at first light, which rotated guards at dusk, which units moved with confidence, and which moved with fear. Every detail mattered, because every detail fed decisions made far behind the front line. In jungle warfare, information traveled slowly. Radios were unreliable. Visibility was measured in yards. Commanders depended on forward observers to tell them what was changing and what was about to happen. A single missed detail could mean an unprepared unit walking into an ambush. A single ignored signal could mean artillery arriving too late. That responsibility shaped everything. Japanese doctrine did not allow uncertainty to exist unchallenged. An unexplained signal was not background noise, it was a potential attack forming in real time. A movement that didn't fit known patterns demanded investigation. A flash, a sound, a silhouette where none had been before could not be dismissed as coincidence. Curiosity wasn't optional, it was mandatory. This was not a weakness in the traditional sense. It was the product of discipline. The same discipline that allowed Japanese units to hold ground against superior firepower. The same discipline that made them dangerous even when outnumbered. But discipline comes with rules. And rules create predictability. American forces were beginning to understand this, even if they couldn't yet articulate it. They noticed how the enemy reacted not randomly, but consistently. Every anomaly produced a response. Every unexplained change triggered observation. Every potential signal pulled attention toward it. The sniper was not just watching Marines. He was watching meaning. And meaning, on a battlefield, is lethal. This was the quiet truth hidden beneath the frustration and the losses. The enemy could not afford to ignore anything that might matter. Doing so violated doctrine. It violated training. It violated the very logic that kept them alive. And that meant attention itself was a fixed point, something that could be counted on. American commanders were used to thinking in terms of suppression and destruction. You neutralized a threat by overwhelming it. You eliminated a position by hitting it harder than it could endure. But this enemy wasn't presenting positions to destroy. He was presenting decisions. Investigate or risk being blindsided. Hold position or risk missing something critical. Expose yourself briefly or operate blind. The sniper's power came from forcing those choices onto his opponents. What began to dawn on the Americans was unsettling. If those choices could be engineered, then the enemy's discipline could be turned against him. This wasn't about tricking a careless soldier. It was about trapping a responsible one, because a disciplined observer does not say, "That's probably nothing." It's about a man de grace. He says, "I need to be sure," he said, and certainty requires exposure. In the jungle, exposure is everything. Leaves part for a second. A branch shifts unnaturally. A head tilts at the wrong angle. Binoculars rise where there were none before. These moments are fleeting, but they are enough. The insight, once seen clearly, was terrifying in its simplicity. The enemy did not need to be fooled completely. He only needed to be compelled to check. And checking meant moving. That realization changed how the Americans framed the problem. The sniper was no longer an invisible predator. He was a professional doing his job, and that job had requirements. He had to confirm. He had to observe. He had to respond. The battlefield, suddenly, was no longer just terrain and weapons. It was a system of expectations, a network of responses waiting to be triggered. What made this especially dangerous for the enemy was that the Americans didn't need to know who the sniper was or exactly where he was hiding. They only needed to know how he was trained to think. And that kind of knowledge scales. It doesn't rely on perfect aim. It doesn't rely on rare equipment. It relies on understanding what the enemy cannot ignore. At first, this understanding didn't come with confidence. It came with hesitation. The idea felt wrong, almost disrespectful to the realities of combat. Using attention as a weapon sounded abstract, academic, removed from the brutal immediacy of men dying in the jungle. But desperation has a way of sharpening unconventional ideas. Because the conventional approach had already failed, the jungle still swallowed sound. The sniper still struck without warning. The losses still accumulated quietly. So the question changed again. Not how do we kill him, but what can we make him look at? That shift was subtle, but it carried enormous consequences. It meant the Americans were no longer reacting to the enemy's initiative. They were preparing to shape it. And once that door opened, it could not be closed again. Because if attention could be forced, then behavior could be shaped. And if behavior could be shaped, then even the most disciplined enemy could be led, step by step, into exposure. The jungle had taught both sides the same lesson. Survival depended on perception. The difference was that now, one side was learning how to control it. In the next phase, this understanding would move from theory to action, from observation to application, from a quiet insight to a deliberate experiment. And when that experiment began, the jungle would stop being a shield. It would become a mirror reflecting the enemy's own discipline back at him, one fatal glance at a time. Ideas don't arrive like revelations. They surface quietly, almost guiltily, when someone notices a pattern others have learned to ignore. Along the perimeter, Marines had begun to see the rhythm. Not the enemy's positions, those remained hidden, but the enemy's responses. Every unexplained change drew attention. Every irregularity demanded confirmation. The jungle did not confuse the sniper. What confused him were things that should not be there. That was the crack. No one framed it as a breakthrough at first. There was no declaration, no sudden confidence. Just a realization that felt uncomfortable precisely because it made sense. The enemy's discipline was predictable, not sloppy, not emotional. Predictable because it followed rules, and rules could be pressured. The shift was not from hunting to trickery. It was from reaction to authorship. Instead of asking how to defeat the sniper's concealment, the Americans began asking how to write what the sniper would see next. This required a different kind of courage. It meant resisting the urge to fire at the first opportunity. It meant planning for moments that might never come. It meant accepting that the most important part of the operation would be invisible to everyone except the enemy. Most of all, it meant trusting that the enemy would do his job. The first attempts were tentative. Not experiments so much as questions posed to the jungle. Small irregularities placed where none had existed before. Changes subtle enough to feel accidental. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed deception. And then, the waiting. Waiting is where plans usually die. Doubt grows fastest when nothing happens. Minutes stretch. The jungle breathes. Insects hum. The temptation to abandon the idea creeps in. But doctrine does not forget. Somewhere out there, An observer noticed something that didn't fit. He didn't panic. He didn't rush. He did what he had been trained to do. He tried to understand it. That was all it took. A shift in posture. A slight movement to gain a better angle. A decision to confirm rather than dismiss. The moment was brief, almost meaningless to anyone else. It was everything. The Americans did not celebrate. They did not rush forward. They did not chase the advantage. They withdrew, quietly, deliberately, leaving the anomaly behind as if it had never mattered. That restraint mattered more than the result, because it proved the concept without revealing it. The jungle, once a shield for the enemy, had become an amplifier. It magnified every deviation, every unnatural alignment, every hint that something had changed. The sniper's greatest strength, patience, became the mechanism of his exposure. What followed was refinement, not repetition. The worst mistake would have been to do the same thing twice. Patterns are a language. The enemy spoke it fluently, so the Americans refused to speak it at all. No anomaly appeared where one had appeared before. No irregularity followed the same timing. No provocation carried the same implication. Some suggested escalation, bigger signals, clearer bait, faster results. They were ignored. Speed was not the objective. Control was. The idea matured into a philosophy. Never force the enemy to guess what you are doing. Force him to question whether he can afford to ignore it. That uncertainty carried more weight than clarity ever could. As the days passed, the battlefield began to change shape, not physically, behaviorally. Observation slowed, response time stretched, movements became cautious to the point of paralysis. Where the enemy had once acted decisively, he now paused, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Calculation is expensive under fire. Every pause meant exposure elsewhere. Every delay created gaps. Every attempt to be thorough produced another opportunity to be seen. The Americans noticed something else, too. The enemy began to look away from the places that mattered. Attention was pulled toward anomalies and away from genuine preparations. The sniper, still deadly, was no longer decisive. This was the reversal. For the first time, the enemy was reacting to American timing instead of imposing his own. He was answering questions the Americans had written for him, even when the answers led nowhere. It would have been easy to mistake this for success already achieved. It wasn't. This phase was fragile. One mistake could expose the entire method. One careless repetition could teach the enemy what to ignore. The margin was thin, and discipline mattered on both sides now. But something irreversible had occurred. The Americans had stopped trying to outshoot the sniper. They had stopped trying to outweight him. They had started to direct him. The battlefield had become a conversation, and for the first time, the Americans were choosing the topic. What made this dangerous was not that it relied on cleverness. It relied on inevitability. A disciplined enemy, confronted with uncertainty, will investigate. That instinct cannot be trained out without blinding the force entirely, and the jungle offered no safe way to investigate. The next step would push this logic further. Not isolated irregularities, but sequences. Not questions, but implications. Signals that suggested intent. Movements that hinted at coordination. Anomalies that demanded not just observation, but interpretation. That was when attention would stop being a reaction. It would become a liability. And when that happened, the enemy would face a choice he could not escape: investigate and expose himself, or refuse to look and surrender control of the battlefield entirely. The moment the Americans realized they could force that choice, the war in this sector stopped being about who could see farther or shoot straighter. It became about who could think one move ahead and who would be compelled to follow. Once the idea proved viable, the battlefield stopped being a place of confrontation and became a system. Not a system of weapons, but a system of expectations. Every army learns to read the environment: tracks in the dirt, broken foliage, sounds that don't belong. In the Pacific jungle, where visibility was limited and surprise was constant, these signs carried enormous weight. They weren't background noise, they were early warnings, and early warnings demand responses. What the Americans were beginning to exploit was something deeper than curiosity. They were exploiting obligation. The enemy wasn't free to choose what mattered. Doctrine had already decided that for him, a signal might be meaningless, but it might also be the first sign of an attack. And because the cost of missing that signal was catastrophic, investigation became mandatory. This was the foundation of false signatures. A false signature isn't a lie. It doesn't try to convince the enemy of something untrue. It only needs to be plausible enough that it cannot be ignored. That distinction mattered. A bad deception screams for attention. A good one whispers just loudly enough to trigger responsibility. The Americans understood that they didn't need the enemy to believe a story. They only needed him to worry that the story might be real. Once worry exists, action follows. At first, these false signatures were simple, small irregularities placed where none had existed before, subtle enough to feel accidental, timed in ways that avoided obvious repetition, nothing that announced intent. Each was designed around a single question. What would a disciplined observer feel compelled to check? The answer changed constantly. Sometimes it was movement. Sometimes it was alignment. Sometimes it was a change in rhythm, something happening at the wrong time of day. The power of these signatures didn't come from complexity. It came from restraint. Too much clarity would reveal the trick. Too much noise would be dismissed as chaos. The balance was delicate, and when it worked, the response was predictable. An observer adjusted position. A lookout shifted to get a better angle. Someone raised optics where there had been none before. These movements were tiny, almost invisible, but they existed in a jungle where nothing moved unless it had to. The key insight was that exposure doesn't require recklessness. It only requires confirmation. Confirmation demands a better view. A better view demands movement. Movement creates a window. The Americans didn't rush to exploit every window. They didn't treat the battlefield like a shooting gallery. Instead, they observed the responses to their own actions, refining their understanding of how the enemy processed uncertainty. This feedback loop was critical. Each reaction taught them something. Each hesitation revealed a threshold. Each delayed response hinted at internal confusion. Over time, the signatures became more sophisticated not in appearance, but in implication. Single anomalies became sequences. Isolated irregularities began to suggest coordination. Patterns emerged that looked accidental until they didn't. This is where the battlefield truly shifted, because now the enemy wasn't just responding to something he saw. He was responding to what he thought it meant. Meaning is heavier than movement. A flicker of uncertainty can be dismissed. A suggestion of coordination cannot. When signals imply planning, intelligence demands confirmation at a higher level. That means more eyes, more observers, more decision-makers drawn forward. And every additional observer adds risk. The Americans began to understand that they were no longer dealing with individual snipers. They were interacting with a hierarchy. Signals moved upward, questions were asked, permissions were sought. Each layer added delay, and delay forced exposure. The enemy, trained to be thorough, became slow. And slowness in combat is lethal. But this wasn't a straight line of success. There were moments when nothing happened, hours when the jungle remained silent, times when signatures produced no visible reaction at all. Those moments were dangerous. Silence invites repetition. Repetition teaches patterns. And patterns, once recognized, can be ignored. So the Americans did the hardest thing possible. They stopped. They let false signatures fade. They allowed uncertainty to linger unresolved. They trusted that the enemy's need for clarity would grow, not diminish. This restraint created pressure. A disciplined force hates unresolved questions. The longer uncertainty exists, the more dangerous it becomes. Eventually, someone must look. When that happened, the response was often stronger than before, more deliberate, more cautious, and therefore more exposed. The jungle, which once protected the observer, now punished him. The very care that had kept him alive made his movements detectable. This phase transformed the psychological balance of the fight. The enemy began to feel acted upon rather than acting. Decisions were no longer proactive. They were reactive, and reactive forces lose initiative even when they retain firepower. What made this especially destructive was that there was no clear countermeasure. You cannot order discipline away. You cannot tell trained observers to stop noticing. You cannot ignore uncertainty without risking catastrophe. The enemy could adapt tactics, but not instincts. And instincts are where false signatures live. By this point, the Americans were no longer simply exploiting attention. They were managing it, guiding it, redirecting it away from real preparations and toward manufactured uncertainties. The battlefield had become asymmetric in a new way. One side reacted, the other side decided what there was to react to. This did not require constant action. It required patience and imagination. It required the humility to let opportunities pass and the discipline to avoid overuse. Most importantly, it required an understanding that the goal was not immediate destruction. The goal was degradation. Degradation of confidence. Degradation of tempo. Degradation of trust in one's own perceptions. When a soldier begins to doubt what he sees, every decision slows. Every movement feels dangerous. Every order carries uncertainty. And when that doubt spreads, it becomes contagious. The enemy was still present, still armed, still dangerous, but he was no longer decisive. In the next phase, this imbalance would intensify, because the enemy would attempt to adapt and in doing so, would trap himself even further. Attention, once weaponized, is difficult to reclaim, and the jungle was about to prove that ignoring nothing can be just as fatal as seeing everything. Adaptation is supposed to save you. On most battlefields, the side that learns faster survives longer. New tactics are countered. Old mistakes are corrected. Patterns are broken before they become fatal. That is what the enemy attempted to do next. The false signatures had worked too well to ignore. Casualties were mounting, not in chaotic bursts, but in a way that felt deliberate. Men were dying while doing exactly what they had been trained to do. And somewhere in the chain of command, it became clear that something was wrong. Orders were issued quietly. Observers were told to be cautious. Investigations were to be conducted with maximum cover. No one was to expose themselves unnecessarily. At first, this seemed like the answer. The jungle grew still. Hours passed with no visible response to anomalies that would previously have triggered immediate investigation. Irregularities went unchallenged. The battlefield appeared to calm. From a distance, it looked like the enemy had solved the problem. But beneath that calm, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Because adaptation did not remove the obligation to observe it, only delayed it. Uncertainty does not disappear when it is ignored. It accumulates. Each unexplained anomaly became a question left unanswered. Each unresolved signal joined a growing list of potential threats. Officers, denied clarity, began to hesitate. Decisions that once took seconds now required consultation. Orders were delayed, rechecked, revised. The enemy had not stopped thinking. He had started thinking too much. This was the trap. By tightening discipline, the enemy increased the psychological cost of every decision. If an observer chose not to investigate and something happened, the blame would be catastrophic. If he chose to investigate and exposed himself, the risk was immediate. Neither option was safe, so he waited. Waiting felt cautious. Waiting felt responsible. Waiting felt like survival. But waiting seeded initiative. The Americans noticed the change almost immediately. The battlefield felt different. Not quieter, heavier. Like air before a storm. The enemy's attention hadn't disappeared. It had become inward, trapped in its own decision-making. This shift opened a new opportunity. The goal was no longer to provoke a single response. It was to create pressure. Instead of isolated false signatures, the Americans began suggesting continuity. Irregularities that hinted at coordination rather than randomness. Changes that implied intent rather than accident. These weren't instructions. They were implications. And implications are harder to ignore. The enemy's adaptation made this worse, because now every potential signal carried higher stakes. Ignoring it felt irresponsible. Investigating it felt lethal. Commanders were forced to intervene. Orders moved downward. Questions moved upward. Time was lost in between. The battlefield slowed further. Units that once maneuvered confidently now hesitated at the edges of clearings. Patrols paused longer before moving. Observers scanned longer, more carefully, more anxiously. This carefulness should have protected them. Instead, it exposed them. Caution requires visibility. Verification requires confirmation. Confirmation requires exposure. The enemy's attempt to be safer had increased the number of moments when men were forced to look more closely, for longer periods of time, from worse positions. The Americans didn't need to force these moments. They simply waited for them to appear. This was the most dangerous phase of the operation, not because it required more action, but because it demanded restraint. Overuse would have revealed the method, impatience would have burned it out. So they applied pressure sparingly. An anomaly here, a suggestion there, then silence. Let the enemy argue with himself. Let doubt do the work. The psychological effect was cumulative. Confidence eroded not because of visible defeat, but because nothing made sense anymore. Signals didn't lead to attacks. Ignoring signals didn't lead to safety. Every choice felt wrong. And when every choice feels wrong, leadership suffers. Orders became vague. Guidance became conditional. Initiative evaporated. The enemy had adapted tactically but strategically. He was now trapped in a feedback loop of hesitation. Every attempt to regain control only deepened uncertainty. This was the reversal the Americans had been waiting for. The false signatures no longer needed to be frequent. Their mere possibility altered behavior. The enemy's own discipline enforced the effect. Even when nothing was happening, the battlefield was now asymmetric in a new way. One side acted only when necessary. The other side acted because it was afraid not to. And fear, when it masquerades as caution, is difficult to detect until it is too late. The jungle still hid weapons. It still swallowed sound. It still punished carelessness. But it no longer favored the enemy. Because now, the most dangerous place wasn't a clearing or a trail. It was the space between decision and action. That space was widening, and in that widening gap, initiative slipped away, one delayed response at a time. In the next phase, this loss of initiative would become visible in ways no order could conceal, not through sudden collapse, but through something far more damaging to a fighting force: paralysis. Paralysis does not arrive like surrender. It arrives quietly, disguised as caution. There was no single moment when the enemy line broke, no dramatic retreat, no order to fall back under pressure. On maps, positions remained occupied. Weapons were still manned. The front looked intact. But functionally, something essential had stopped working. Decisions slowed to a crawl. Patrols that once moved on schedules now waited for permission. Observers scanned longer but reported less. Officers hesitated before committing men to tasks that would have been routine days earlier. Every action felt like a gamble, not against the enemy's firepower, but against uncertainty itself. The false signatures no longer needed to appear. The expectation of them was enough. Soldiers began watching the jungle not for threats, but for tricks. Every flicker of light, every misplaced sound, every irregular shadow became a potential trap. The environment was no longer neutral terrain. It was hostile information, and hostile information erodes trust. Trust in orders, trust in instincts, trust in what the eye reports. When trust erodes, initiative dies. This was most visible in the behavior of observers. Their role required decisiveness. They were supposed to notice, identify, and report. But now, identification carried risk. Reporting meant drawing attention. Attention meant exposure. So they watched longer, long enough to be sure, long enough to confirm, long enough to justify their decision to themselves. Those extra seconds mattered. On a battlefield measured in moments, hesitation was not neutral. It was dangerous. And yet, it felt responsible. That contradiction spread. Patrol leaders became reluctant to deviate from known routes, even when intelligence suggested they should. Deviating meant encountering unknowns, and unknowns were now associated with death. Better to accept a known risk than to invite an invisible one. Officers struggled to interpret reports that were increasingly cautious, increasingly qualified, increasingly uncertain. Language softened. Possibly. Unclear. May. Indicate. Hidden. Action requires clarity. Clarity was gone. The enemy force had not been defeated. It had been blinded, not because it could no longer see, but because it no longer trusted what it saw. This was the most destructive effect of the operation. Casualties mattered, but they were not decisive by themselves. What mattered was the breakdown of confidence, the sense that perception itself had become unreliable. When soldiers stop trusting their observations, they stop acting. And when they stop acting, they lose the initiative. The Americans felt the shift before they could articulate it. Resistance thinned in subtle ways. Movement slowed. The tempo of engagement changed. Areas that had once been contested aggressively now felt vacant, not empty, just inactive. This was not retreat. It was hesitation made visible. The jungle amplified the effect. Dense foliage already limited visibility. Now, that limitation was compounded by doubt. Every branch could conceal deception. Every sound could be manufactured. The environment itself felt weaponized. The enemy had adapted tactically, but psychologically he was overwhelmed. And this is where the true imbalance emerged. A force that is unsure cannot synchronize. Units cannot support each other if they cannot predict when and where action will occur. Coordination suffers. Timelines slip. Opportunities are missed. All without a single decisive engagement. The battlefield did not punish the enemy for being weak. It punished him for being uncertain. The Americans understood this instinctively. They resisted the urge to press aggressively. Overextension would have restored clarity. A visible assault would have given the enemy something concrete to react to. Instead, they maintained ambiguity. Let the enemy argue with himself. Let him hesitate. Let him second-guess. This restraint preserved the asymmetry. As days passed, the psychological cost became evident in leadership behavior. Orders were issued later. Decisions were deferred. Responsibility was pushed upward. Junior leaders waited for guidance that came too slowly to matter. This centralization is a sign of stress. Confident units decentralize. They empower lower levels to act. Paralyzed units do the opposite. They seek permission. They seek certainty. They seek someone else to own the risk. But risk cannot be delegated away. The enemy had been forced into an impossible posture. He could not act decisively without exposing himself. He could not remain passive without losing control. Every option carried consequences. And so he chose the only thing that felt safe. He chose to wait. Waiting preserved lives in the short term. Waiting preserved positions on maps. Waiting preserved the appearance of control. But waiting surrendered the future. Because initiative, once lost, does not return on its own. By the time the enemy realized that hesitation itself had become the battlefield, the damage was already done. Morale had shifted. Confidence had thinned. The force was still present, still armed, still dangerous, but no longer decisive. The Americans did not need to announce victory. They could feel it in the rhythm of the fight. The jungle no longer reacted with the same sharpness. The enemy no longer imposed tempo. The silence had changed. Before, silence meant danger. Now, silence meant indecision. This was paralysis without defeat, and it was far more damaging than any single loss. In the next phase, this paralysis would ripple upward, beyond individual units, beyond the front line, into doctrine itself, forcing the enemy to confront a truth no training manual could easily solve. Because how do you fight an enemy who wins by making you doubt your own perception? Paralysis at the front does not stay at the front. When units stop moving with confidence, higher command feels it long before reports explain it. Timelines slip. Expected reactions don't occur. Orders are carried out correctly, but slowly, cautiously, without initiative. From above, it looks like resistance without collapse. From inside, it feels like control slipping away. That contradiction drew attention. Commanders began asking questions that did not have comfortable answers. Why were patrols avoiding engagement? Why were observers reporting less while watching more? Why did every operation seem to stall at the moment decisive action was required? The enemy was still there. The terrain had not changed. Firepower ratios were unchanged. And yet, effectiveness was declining. At first, explanations focused on fatigue. Jungle warfare was exhausting. Nerves were frayed. Men were cautious because they were smart enough to survive. All reasonable conclusions. But they didn't explain the pattern. Caution had become selective. It appeared strongest not in moments of obvious danger, but in moments of ambiguity. Places where nothing was happening produced more hesitation than places where fighting was expected. That was the clue. The problem wasn't fear of the enemy, it was fear of misjudgment. Reports began filtering upward that hinted at something deeper. Units describing difficulty interpreting the environment. Observers noting that they could no longer distinguish natural irregularities from deliberate deception. Officers expressing concern that their men were hesitating not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked confidence in what they were seeing. This was not a tactical failure. It was a cognitive one. At this level, armies do not look for individual explanations. They look for systemic ones. Patterns are not blamed on soldiers. They are blamed on doctrine, training, assumptions, and doctrine, by definition, is slow to change. That slowness matters. The enemy's training had been built around vigilance, around the belief that awareness prevents surprise, around the idea that noticing more leads to better outcomes. That belief had served them well until it didn't. Now it was being turned inward, feeding hesitation instead of action. The same discipline that once created advantage was now producing overload. This forced an uncomfortable realization. There was no easy fix. You cannot order soldiers to stop noticing. You cannot train observers to ignore anomalies without blinding them entirely. You cannot remove uncertainty from a jungle battlefield. Any attempt to do so would trade one vulnerability for another, so the institution responded the only way it could. It tried to codify restraint. Guidelines were issued, protocols refined. Investigations were to be conducted more deliberately, exposure minimized, anomalies categorized, responses delayed until corroborated. On paper, this looked like adaptation. In practice, it formalized hesitation. The more structured the response became, the slower it grew. Decision-making moved upward, authority centralized, initiative drained away from the edges of the force, where it mattered most. This is the hidden cost of fighting an enemy who manipulates perception. The enemy does not need to defeat your units. He only needs to force your institution to protect itself from making mistakes. Mistake avoidance is the enemy of initiative. The Americans, watching this from the other side, understood something crucial. The effectiveness of their approach did not come from cleverness alone. It came from permission. Permission to experiment. Permission to deviate. Permission to let junior leaders try ideas that did not fit existing manuals. That permission was not universal. It was contextual. It existed because commanders were desperate, because conventional methods had failed, because the situation demanded adaptation faster than doctrine could provide. And that difference mattered. Where one institution tightened control, the other loosened it. Where one sought certainty before action, the other accepted uncertainty as a tool. This contrast did more than shape a single engagement. It revealed something fundamental about how militaries learn. Rigid systems absorb shocks by slowing down. Flexible systems absorb shocks by changing shape. The enemy's doctrine was not wrong. It was simply too optimized for a battlefield that no longer existed. It assumed that uncertainty was something to be resolved, not something to be weaponized. Once that assumption broke, everything built on top of it wobbled. This is why the impact of the operation extended beyond the jungle. It wasn't the specific method that mattered. It was the realization that perception itself could be contested not just through camouflage or concealment, but through deliberate manipulation of attention. That realization forces institutions to rethink fundamentals. What counts as a threat? Who decides when to respond? How much uncertainty is acceptable before action becomes paralysis? These are not questions with quick answers. By the time the enemy began to grapple with them, the immediate damage was already done. Units had lost tempo. Confidence had thinned. Initiative had slipped away. The Americans did not need to press the advantage loudly. The imbalance had moved beyond individual actions. It now lived in training rooms, briefing tents, and command discussions. And that is where the most lasting effects of this operation would be felt. Not in casualty reports, not in captured ground, but in the slow, uneasy recognition that a disciplined army had been forced to confront a weakness it could not easily train out, the vulnerability that comes from needing to understand everything before acting. In the next act, This realization will collide with the story that grows afterward, the legend, the simplification, and the dangerous temptation to reduce a complex institutional lesson into a single clever trick. Stories hate complexity. They smooth it out. They sharpen edges. They compress chaos into something neat enough to remember. What happened in the jungle was not neat. It was slow, conditional, fragile. It depended on restraint as much as action, on timing as much as courage, on understanding psychology more than pulling a trigger. But that is not how it would be remembered. As the fighting moved on and the noise of the campaign shifted elsewhere, the explanation that survived was the simplest one. A clever idea, an improvised trick, one man thinking differently and changing everything. It was tempting, it was dramatic, and it was incomplete. Because myths focus on what happened, not why it worked. The danger of the myth wasn't exaggeration, it was reduction. When a complex system failure is explained as a clever gimmick, the lesson becomes shallow. Repeat the trick, and you'll get the same result. But that was never true. What worked in the jungle did not work because of the object, or the signal, or even the deception itself. It worked because of context, because of doctrine, because of psychology, because one side was rigid at the moment the other side was allowed to bend. Remove any of those elements, and the outcome changes. This is where many post-war interpretations went wrong. They searched for the method instead of the mechanism. They wanted the how without confronting the why. 1. And that misunderstanding is dangerous, because it leads to imitation without comprehension. You can copy a technique. You cannot copy a mindset. The operation succeeded because it exploited a specific institutional pressure point. The enemy's need for certainty, the inability to ignore anomalies, the obligation to investigate, the fear of missing something critical. Those pressures existed before the first false signature appeared. The deception did not create them. It activated them. This distinction matters. Without that pressure, the same actions would have meant nothing. They would have been dismissed as noise, ignored, written off as environmental chaos. The jungle is full of irregularities. Only a trained observer assigns meaning to them. That training was both the enemy's strength and his vulnerability. The myth also obscured the most uncomfortable truth of all. This was not a victory achieved through heroics alone. It was enabled by an institution willing to tolerate uncertainty on its own side. Junior leaders were not punished for trying something unconventional. They were not shut down for deviating from doctrine. They were given room to experiment because the situation demanded it. That permission is rare in war. Most institutions default to control under pressure. They centralize decisions. They restrict deviation. They seek certainty before action. In this case, the opposite happened, and that difference mattered more than any individual action. The myth also hid the fragility of the outcome. This was not a permanent solution. It was not universally applicable. Once the enemy began to recognize the broader pattern, counters emerged. Procedures were adjusted. Discipline was redefined. The window closed. That does not diminish the achievement. It clarifies it. What happened was not the discovery of a magic trick. It was the exposure of a blind spot, one that existed only under specific conditions, for a limited time, against a specific way of thinking. The real lesson was not, use deception. If gone. Every army already does that. The lesson was that perception itself can be overloaded, that when a force becomes too focused on not missing anything, it risks losing the ability to decide anything. And when decision-making slows, initiative slips away regardless of weapons, training, or courage. This is why reducing the story to a clever anecdote misses its weight. It turns a systemic failure into a novelty. It encourages repetition instead of reflection. The jungle did not reward cleverness alone. It rewarded understanding. Understanding of how discipline shapes behavior. Understanding of how obligation drives action. Understanding of how fear of being wrong can be more paralyzing than fear of being killed. Those are not comfortable lessons. They don't fit neatly into inspirational summaries or simple tactical manuals, but they are the lessons that last. In the next act, the story moves beyond the jungle entirely into why this episode still matters long after the terrain has been reclaimed by vines and rain and why modern battlefields continue to struggle with the same problem under different names. Because technology changes, terrain changes, but human attention and its limits do not. Long after the jungle reclaimed the battlefield, the problem it exposed never went away. Only the names changed. Modern battlefields look nothing like Bougainville. Sensors have replaced observers. Drones hover where snipers once hid. Data streams in volumes that would have overwhelmed any wartime commander in the 1,940 seconds. And yet, the same pressure exists, maybe more, because today, the danger is no longer missing a signal. It is missing the right one. Modern forces are built around awareness, persistent surveillance, continuous feeds, layers of information designed to eliminate surprise. Every movement is logged, every anomaly flagged, every irregularity recorded. This seems like progress, but it creates the same obligation the jungle once did. Nothing important can be ignored, and that obligation carries a cost. Commanders now face an environment where false positives are constant. Blips on screens, heat signatures, electronic noise, civilian movement, environmental interference. Each one demands assessment. Investigate too much, and tempo collapses. Ignore too much, and catastrophe follows. The balance is razor thin. This is where the jungle's lesson resurfaces. False signatures no longer look like flashes of light or misplaced sounds. They look like drone tracks that don't quite fit patterns, electronic emissions that suggest coordination, signals that might indicate preparation or might mean nothing at all. The principle hasn't changed. What has changed is scale. In the Pacific, uncertainty slowed a battalion. Today, it can stall an entire command structure. The same psychological pressure applies. Decision-makers hesitate not because they lack courage, but because the cost of being wrong has grown. In a networked battlefield, one misjudgment propagates instantly. One ignored anomaly can cascade into disaster. So leaders wait. They ask for more confirmation. They request additional feeds. They delay action until uncertainty feels manageable. And while they wait, initiative slips. This is not a technological failure. It is a human one. Technology amplifies attention. It does not resolve how humans process it. The jungle forced observers to confront limited visibility. Modern systems confront commanders with excessive visibility. Both produce the same stress. Too much uncertainty to act confidently. Too much responsibility to ignore. This is why deception remains effective even against advanced systems. Not because the systems are flawed, but because they are operated by humans. Humans who must decide when to trust what they see. The deeper lesson of the jungle was not about tools. It was about tempo. The side that controls when decisions must be made controls the fight. By forcing the enemy to constantly reassess, to constantly verify, to constantly doubt, the Americans imposed their rhythm on the battlefield. The enemy reacted. The Americans decided. That dynamic persists. Cyber operations do the same thing today, flooding systems with anomalies, creating noise that forces defenders to investigate constantly. The goal is not penetration, it is exhaustion. Not destruction, but hesitation. Psychological operations exploit attention directly, saturating information spaces with signals that demand response. Each response consumes time, credibility, and focus. Even civilian systems are vulnerable. Emergency services overwhelmed by false reports. Infrastructure strained by signals that require verification. The logic is identical. The battlefield has expanded. The principle remains. What makes this uncomfortable is that there is no permanent defense. You cannot train people to ignore uncertainty without creating blindness. You cannot investigate everything without slowing to a stop. Every system that values awareness faces this trade-off. This is why the story from the jungle endures, not because it was clever, but because it revealed a limit in human attention, a limit in institutional decision-making, a limit that technology cannot erase. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with better weapons. It is the one who understands how you decide. And once someone understands that, they don't need to defeat you directly. They only need to force you to hesitate. This is why modern doctrine emphasizes tempo and initiative so obsessively. Why decentralization is praised but rarely practiced under stress. Why rigid control returns the moment uncertainty spikes. The jungle showed what happens when uncertainty is used deliberately. It turns discipline into delay, caution into paralysis, awareness into vulnerability. The lesson is not comforting. It suggests that no matter how advanced systems become, they will always be constrained by the humans who interpret them. And that means the core question remains unchanged from 1943. Who decides what matters? Who controls when attention must be paid? Because the side that answers those questions first does not just win battles, it shapes how the enemy fights them. In the final act, the story closes not with victory or celebration, but with reflection on cost, on restraint, and on the uncomfortable truth that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield is still the human mind, working under pressure, trying not to make the wrong choice. Victory rarely looks the way stories promise it will. There was no moment of triumph in the jungle, no dramatic collapse, no clear signal that the fight had been decided. Positions were still occupied, weapons were still manned, the enemy remained present, armed, and dangerous. But something essential had been lost: the ability to act with confidence. What unfolded over those days did not end the campaign, and it did not win the war on its own. Its impact was quieter, deeper, and more unsettling. It showed how a disciplined force could be undone without being overpowered, not through superior weapons, but through superior understanding of human limits. The cost of that understanding was not abstract. Every forced hesitation carried human weight. Every moment of doubt was paid for by soldiers on both sides. Every choice to exploit uncertainty meant accepting responsibility for its consequences. That moral weight matters. It is easy to frame this story as ingenuity triumphing over rigidity. It is harder and more honest to acknowledge what that ingenuity required. It required patience, restraint, and the willingness to let uncertainty do damage slowly rather than ending the fight quickly and visibly. The Americans involved did not celebrate what they had learned. They documented it. They analyzed it. They taught it carefully, stripped of drama and excess, because they understood its danger. This was not a trick to be repeated thoughtlessly. It was a lesson to be handled with care, because once perception becomes a battlefield, everything becomes suspect. The jungle taught a harsh truth. When soldiers can no longer trust what they see, courage alone is not enough. Training alone is not enough. Even discipline becomes a liability when it demands certainty in an environment designed to deny it. The enemy learned that lesson painfully. The Americans learned it uneasily. Both carried it forward. Long after the terrain changed and the war moved on, the principle remained embedded in doctrine and training, often unspoken, rarely emphasized, but always present. Control the tempo, shape attention, force decisions under uncertainty. But the deeper lesson runs in the opposite direction. Every military, every institution, every system that values awareness must confront the same limit. There is a point where seeing more does not mean understanding more, where vigilance stops protecting and starts consuming. The jungle did not reward cruelty or cleverness. It rewarded restraint and insight. Those who survived understood that the most dangerous moments were not when the enemy attacked, but when the enemy was forced to decide, and that remains true. In modern conflicts, in information warfare, in any environment saturated with signals, the greatest risk is not being outmatched, it is being overwhelmed by the responsibility to interpret everything correctly. The story ends not with a lesson about deception, but with a warning. Attention is powerful. Discipline is necessary. But without judgment, both can be turned against you. The jungle has long since reclaimed the ground where this happened. Leaves cover the places where men once waited, watched, and hesitated. The false signatures are gone. The weapons have rusted away. What remains is the understanding that wars are not won solely by those who see the most, but by those who know when to look, when to act, and when to accept that uncertainty is not a flaw to be eliminated, but a force to be respected. That is how the fight was changed, not with bigger guns, but with better thinking. In the end, this wasn't a story about a trick. It was a story about pressure, about what happens when trained, disciplined soldiers are forced to make decisions in an environment where every signal might matter and every decision might be fatal. about how certainty collapses not under chaos, but under too much meaning. The jungle didn't defeat anyone outright. It exposed a limit in attention, a limit in judgment, a limit in how much uncertainty a human mind can carry before hesitation takes over. That limit still exists, not just in war but anywhere decisions are made under pressure, with incomplete information and real consequences. The tools change, the terrain changes, the signals multiply, but the problem remains the same. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you were on that battlefield, knowing that ignoring a signal could cost lives, but investigating it could cost lives too, what would you have done differently? Would you investigate everything? Would you force stricter discipline? Or would you accept uncertainty and risk being wrong? There is no safe answer. That's why this story matters. If this episode made you rethink how decisions are forced, manipulated, or delayed under pressure, leave a comment below with one insight that stood out to you, not a summary, just the one idea you'll remember. And if there's another overlooked tactic, forgotten innovation, or uncomfortable lesson from history you want explored next, write it down. The best stories often come from the questions people are still arguing about decades later. I read the comments carefully,